While they're getting my slides up, I just want to say what an honor and a privilege it is to be here. I'm very grateful that Ken asked me to attend. I'd like to begin by, really would be remiss if I didn't begin with thanking him for a truly stellar career. But I want to do more than that. I think those of you who work with Ken knows he's really a good guy. And good guys are hard to find in our profession. I didn't say that. You're okay though, George, don't worry. And so I'd like to congratulate you for a life well lived. And I mean that, I hear myself say that, and it almost sounds like a eulogy. No, I didn't come to Bowling Green to bury you, I came to praise you. Okay, well, before I dig myself in any deeper, that's a pun. I'm transitioning, that's right. This is forward? Yes, good. I want to thank Annette. She gave us a very good template to follow. So I'm going to dutifully follow that and show why religion matters. And I'm going to do that by looking at my stuff on social relationships that arise in the church. And then second, I'm going to talk about unresolved issues in the field. And I'm going to do that as a way of transitioning over to Ken's work. And I'm going to talk about things related to his stuff on spiritual struggles. So let me begin with what would I like people to know about what I do? Well, I think I'm the only sociologist on the panel, so that makes me duty-bound to say something social. And I'll do this by focusing on social relationships that at least should be flourishing in religious institutions. And it really surprises me that we don't see more research on this topic. And the reason why is when you look at all the great founders of sociology, psychology, psychiatry, they all talked about social relationships. And here's just a couple just to get you thinking. Here's James Mark Baldwin. He was an early president of the American Psychological Association. And as you can see from this overhead, for him, social relationships lie right at the heart of religion. Here's another one. This is, whoops. Yeah, there it is. A sociologist, 1892, president of the American Sociological Association. He defines religion solely in terms of social relationships. And then last, this is Josiah Royce. Anybody ever read his stuff? It's really great. He was a friend and confidant of William James, and actually an antagonist, I suppose, too. And he defines salvation itself in terms of the relationships that people form with each other. So, hopefully I've got you thinking about social relationships and religion a little bit at this point. But perhaps more important, at least from my perspective, is whether social relationships affect health. And I think research that's been done on social relationships in secular settings would certainly answer that question with a resounding yes. Here's how my colleague at University of Michigan, Jim House, this is what he's got to say about social relationships in health. And this appeared in the very prestigious journal Science. I mean, it's like getting your picture on a cover of Rolling Stone, I suppose. But he sees it as being social relationships are more important for health than cigarette smoking. That's a dramatic statement. Well, it's easy to toss around this phrase social relationships. There's different kinds of social relationships. People help each other in different ways. But people also give and receive support. And I just want to take a few moments just to review some of the work that I've done that relates to the giving and receiving of social support as a way of answering that question, do they affect health? Well, I think we can all agree that helping people who are in need really lies at the basis of many of the great world's faiths. And so what my research indicates is that, and here's a citation to one of the studies, is that when you help others, when you give social support to others, it offsets the effects of stress on mortality. But when you receive support from others, you don't get that same stress buffering function. Now, I've got a second paper out that's under review right now, and it's from a study that was very generously funded by the Templeton Foundation. And it looks at giving and receiving support. And giving support to others offsets the effects of living in a rundown neighborhood on measured waist-hip ratios, right? So we went out there and actually measured this. But receiving doesn't have that effect. So what my research shows, at least, is that it is truly more blessed to give than it is to receive, at least in terms of your health. Okay, well, given all this, let me bridge over to Ken's stuff, and I'll do this and point out some of the shortcomings in social support research in the process. And I want to just ask two very basic questions. First, does church-based social support help people cope with spiritual struggles? And second, precisely what do church-based support providers do? What is it they do exactly? Well, I'm sure that you are all familiar with Ken and Julie's work on spiritual struggles. And a lot of that work shows that spiritual struggles creates both mental health and physical health problems. But if you read it carefully, sometimes it provides an opportunity for growth and development. I got to interject this. You know, when you were saying any more questions, I wanted to ask one, but I'm just going to stick it in here right now. Growth. When do you measure growth? Time-wise. I look at my life and I see stuff that happened 20 years ago. I'm going, oh, you know, I'm just barely understanding it now. So when does growth take place? You got me. Anyway, back to what I want to do is two quick questions here. What factors determine whether spiritual struggles have desirable and undesirable effects? And second, what, if anything, does social relationships in the church have to do with this? And I think a lot of this answer may be found by focusing on the potential role that church-based social supports play in the coping process with spiritual struggles. And in my opinion, I don't think we've seen enough on coping with spiritual struggles. We see what spiritual struggles are, but what specifically do people do when they're confronted by them? And I want to reflect on how people can help with spiritual struggles and several other issues. So there's four altogether that I'd like to look at. I want to ask, first, do church-based social ties help at all? And if they do, in a very general way, how might that help? Second is more specific. What are the particular things that significant others do that might help people deal with spiritual struggles? And then third, I think that significant others at church can be a source of spiritual struggles. They can be part of the problem. And I want to use this as a platform for thinking about the measurement of spiritual struggles. And then the fourth one is more of a dynamic or timing issue. If social support really helps people deal with spiritual struggles, when do significant others actually come on the scene? When do they actually come into that spiritual struggles process? One of my biggest complaints about my own education, at least, has been I was never taught how to think dynamically. But yet the phenomena that we study change over time. And we don't think well enough in those areas. Okay, so take it from the top. How might significant others at church help people deal with spiritual struggles? And I'd just like to turn to a very classic article in 1981, Gerald Kaplan, who was the founder of the community psychiatry movement. And Kaplan's work is, I think, very relevant because spiritual struggles are a form of religious stress. Okay, well, Kaplan says that when people are confronted by a stressor, their usual problem-solving abilities are compromised. And when this happens, they turn to others for help. And others help in three ways. First thing they do is they help define the problem situation. And I see this a lot like primary appraisals in the Lazarus Folkman kind of framework. The second thing they do is they provide a plan for eradicating a stressor. And then the third thing they do is they provide feedback and guidance as the plan is being executed. Well, this is all good, but this gets to the first problem with social support literature. And I think it bridges both that and perhaps social support as it provides those spiritual struggles. What do you mean they help propose a plan? That's not good enough. That's not specific enough. Was it a good plan or was it a bad plan? I imagine most of you have seen the movie Animal House, right? Remember Delta Chi fraternity? Flounder gets his brother's car and his brothers take it out and they wreck it. And Flounder's just there, he's crying like crazy, and John Belushi looks at him and says, "If I were you, I'd begin drinking heavily." Well, that's informational support, but I'm not sure that's very good informational support. So first, that's just an example of we need to know precisely what's going on. We don't get to that at our level of measurement. And that really is the second thing. What are significant others doing when they provide support for people who are struggling? And here's something from the ARCOPE, which says that I sought support from members of my congregation. Well, two issues. One, did you find it? Right? Because expecting support and not getting it, according to George Brown, is a devastating stressor. Okay, second thing, when you found support, did John Belushi give it to you? You know, I don't know. But let me quickly come to Ken's defense. I'm not here to bury you, right? I think that when you developed the ARCOPE, you were trying to develop measures of how people cope with a wide range of stressors. You had to straddle a lot of stuff. But yet when we talk about coping with spiritual struggles, I think we have to get much more focused, because if you stay at a very general level, then you lose conceptual precision and you lose data analytic precision. Well, criticism is easy. Give me a solution. And I can only give you a partial one at this point, and it goes back to my work on religious doubt. Here's a citation. This is a paper I did with my pal Chris Ellison. And just like other spiritual struggles, we learn that doubt can be a good thing or doubt can be a bad thing. And doubt, can be good if it's working successfully through very abstract, and kind of hard to grapple with religious issues. But it can be a deep source of distress if it's not resolved. So if this distinction isn't dealt with specifically when we study doubt as a spiritual struggle, then I think we're going to either overlook the effects of doubt altogether or at least underestimate them. So what we did in this study was we came up with two very specific coping responses for dealing with doubt specifically. And here you can see the first one is a lot like avoidance coping from Lazarus and Folkman. Whenever I have doubts, I try to put them out of my mind. But notice how it's grounded right in doubts, right? And then the second one talks about working through religious doubts has helped me to better understand my faith. It gives you kind of a growth perspective. Okay, well, as it turned out in this study, suppressing doubt led to a decline in self-rated health over time. This was a longitudinal study. But seeking growth was not. Okay, but social relationships were involved in the mix of this, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But this is the third issue that I referred to earlier, and this is the one that deals with whether significant others at church can either create spiritual struggles or at least exacerbate ones that have already been there. Assume that a person experiences religious doubt. So they turn to a fellow church member, and you would like to think that the fellow church member would help them. But that may not always be the case. They may instead encounter rejection, ostracism, criticism. Why? Because when you doubt your faith, it threatens my faith, is a potential problem. Okay, well, this creates, I think, an issue when you go to measure spiritual struggles. Here's an item from Ken's interpersonal spiritual struggles. Felt frustrated or annoyed by the actions of religious or spiritual people. Well, I think a person who's been rejected by religious others because they're harboring religious doubts would certainly answer this in a positive way. But then doing so raises another important issue about the measurement of it. This is of spiritual struggles. Here's an item from the intrapersonal. I always get the intra and inter. You've got to get a different label for that. Worried that my actions were morally or spiritually wrong. Assume that I experienced religious doubt and that I turned to church members for support. But then assume that people are critical or rejecting of me. Wouldn't I answer this second item in the affirmative? I've got doubts. I shouldn't be worrying. I feel bad about doing this. Something must be wrong with me. So this raises question. Are interpersonal struggles conceptually part of spiritual struggles, or are they the cause of spiritual struggles? And don't tell me, oh, I did my factor analysis and they all load on the same factor, blah, blah, blah. You ever hear something called the postulate of factor causation? Sure. What does that mean? That means that when a machine does a factor analysis, it looks at bivariate correlation coefficients. But a correlation between the two items can mean not one thing, but two things. It can mean, yes, these items measure the same phenomena, or it could mean that the first item causes the second item. The machine's dumb. It can't tell you the difference between the two. You have to figure that out yourself. Okay, given all this, let me turn to my study on religious doubt, just to show how social relationships can, a little bit more about it, interfere with spiritual struggles. Remember, I mentioned the study I did with Chris Ellison. I said, seeking growth had no effect on health. Why? I don't know. One thing I can think of, though, is this, and I've noticed this in so many different areas of research, that the negative always seems to trump the positive. If you have negative effects or a negative construct, it always seems to be stronger than the positive one. And so I think that being aware of that made us realize, well, what is causing this negative part of spiritual struggles? And we found out that negative interaction in the church was a strong predictor of religious doubt. And again, this is kind of a longitudinal study. And I think that I experienced doubt. I turned to others for support. Instead they're critical of me, I must be doing something wrong. But what about the second part of this? Why was growth not a factor in all this? Why? And all I can say is, I just finished reading Jonathan Haidt's book, Happiness Hypothesis. You guys see that one? This guy writes well. He really writes well. He would answer it in evolutionary terms. We pay more attention to the negative because that's more adaptive evolution from an evolutionary perspective. Okay, where are we? Well, social relationships and spiritual struggles may be related, but we got to figure out which form that relationship takes. Social relationships in the church may help people cope with spiritual struggles. They may cause spiritual struggles, or they may actually be a type of spiritual struggle. So if we really want to get to the bottom of all this, we got to kind of work out all this. And that gets me to my fourth issue, which is the one about timing. In order to reflect on this, we have to think about the social support process a little more deeply. 25 years ago, John Eckenrode and Elaine Wethington wrote a really nice paper on the social support process. And they said that when stressors first arise in life, people don't immediately run out and try to get social support. They try to resolve the problem on their own first. And you say, well, why would they do that? Well, they don't want to burn out their social support systems. You ever have a friend that's been overly needy? Oh, this happened. Oh, man, after a while, you just slam the door, right? Second, it protects the ego from having to rely on others. And third, sometimes stresses are embarrassing or, potentially embarrassing. You've had a divorce, you've lost your job. Well, anyway, what Eckenrode and Wethington go on to say is that only after a person's tried to work through this on their own and been unsuccessful do they then reach out to significant others for support. And that's interesting, but wait a minute. So what that really says is that social support is not necessarily something good because it's more of scarlet letter. It's an indicator of failed individual coping responses. But here's why I want to work it in now with spiritual struggles. If Eckenrode and Wethington are correct, and people try to resolve problems on their own and are unsuccessful, that's when something like distress is going to arise. If that's true and people seek support to help with their spiritual struggles, then spiritual struggles are coming on the scene, but relatively later on in the process. So that the person's already distressed, and that changes the research question in a very subtle, but I think a very important way. Because now the question is not, does social support prevent psychological distress from arising when people experience spiritual struggles, but rather, does social support prevent distress that's already there from becoming chronic, or is it more of a does it turn it into more of a temporary thing? But either case, what we're looking at is a dynamic phenomenon. It can't be addressed with cross-sectional data. This is why we need longitudinal research. And just one quick example. Well, let me just kind of wrap up by returning to where I started. I'd really like to make a plea for bringing social relationships in the church into the realm of research on spiritual struggles. I think the questions that people wrestle with are difficult, to say the least. They're abstract. They're very taxing. And there are no definitive answers. And I think this is especially true with religious doubt. Because we find ourselves, I think, in such a thick fog, it seems only natural that we're going to reach out to trusted others to try and help us resolve what's going on. My wife's a film major, so I think I've seen every film that's been made. And Papillon, right? You ever see that one? Remember, he's put in solitary confinement, and he's in there for, I think, a year or something. And they're finally about to let him out, so they open up the little peephole, and he sticks his head out. And what is the very first question he asks? How do I look? Right? He doesn't say any one of a number of things. And you think solitary confinement for a year, is there anything more stressful than that? Well, probably, but it's a short list. So what he's doing is he's reaching out to someone else to help define the situation. That's what he's doing. So I think that's why social support in the church is so essential. Here's, if I can get it on here, there it is. Peter Berger's Sociological Theory of Religion. Have you guys read that? 1967, it's a real classic. And he talks about how do people develop worldviews. And religious worldviews are nothing more than beliefs about the sacred. And he says that they're socially constructed and socially maintained. And they're constantly being reconstructed. And what are those social processes? Later on in the same volume, he tells us it's conversation with new or existing significant others. So the very foundation of how we define what religion is all about is something that we work out with others. So as you go through what you do, I hope that you remember that when things get tough, many times we get by with a little help from our friends. Thank you.